Do I have standing? Like some vicinity, yeah.
All right. Welcome everyone. So thanks for coming to our event today. This is Robin. He is UNICEF UK's organizational lead for sustainability, covering climate change, environment, and water. So yeah, he has 10 years experience in the international development sector, and across many countries, alongside 5 years working for a water sewage company in the UK. So yeah, please welcome Rob. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Soya. Thanks for the invitation and to the society. My name's Robin Ward. It's a pleasure to be invited to talk to you today. I always jump at the opportunity to talk about UNICEF, which is an organization that I really love and is doing really great work. It's great to have that opportunity to tell you about what we do, particularly sustainable energy and climate resilience kind of sector. So just quickly, a bit about myself. So I'm the climate sustainability lead at UNICEF UK. Because we're in the university, I thought I would tell you my kind of academic background. So I'm currently studying a master's in climate change and development at SOAS, about halfway through. And then, but I completed the master's in water management from Cranfield University. But my professional life started, I guess, about 15 years ago. And I've worked in, as Soya was mentioning, lots of different countries around the world, including with UNICEF, where I worked in Mongolia and Malawi. And then also quite recently, I was Chief Technical Advisor to the government of Solomon Islands for climate change adaptation, particularly in the water area. So my background's coming from more the water side, but as I've kind of gone through my career, I've kind of pivoted more and more towards the climate side, while still keeping that kind of link to water. So in terms of the talk, there's quite a few slides, but don't worry, I'll skip through it quite quickly. It's quite light. It's not getting too technical, which I think is what we need at this time of the day. But hopefully it can give you a bit of maybe a refreshing and a different kind of perspective on sustainable energy and climate resilience. I'll give you a quick introduction to UNICEF, just more broadly, then talk to you about what climate and sustainability means for us at UNICEF. Then do a bit more of a deep dive on what does sustainable energy mean to us at UNICEF and our work. Give some program examples, and then just briefly some reflections and thoughts at the end. So in terms of an introduction to UNICEF. So if you didn't know, that UNICEF is all about children, basically. So it's United Nations Children's Fund. And of course, children are central to everything that we do. The reason it doesn't match the acronym was originally United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, because it was set up straight after World War II. So very much everything that we did was about emergency response and recovery to the World War. But the work evolved much more than that. So we lost the emergency part on the way. And I guess it was just assumed that we are international because we're the United Nations. So everything we do is about children, and it's all about advancing the rights of and the well-being of children, of all children, wherever they are, it doesn't matter. But because children in different places and different situations, they very much their rights are either realized or not to different extents. UNICEF very much focuses on children that are more living in marginalized areas, excluded from services, things like that. So that can be children living in fragile zones. It could be a child with disability. So it's not just the geography, but the situation of the child, or even a child that's living in a country where climate change is a big issue for them. And we have this one key document that is kind of our policy framework. Is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UNCRC, and this is the basis of all of UNICEF's work. It's a convention, a general UN convention, so it's not just owned by UNICEF. but it is particularly relevant for UNICEF because UNICEF are the only like child-focused UN agency. And actually, UNICEF are mentioned within that policy framework that as the only organization kind of singled out that can provide like technical expertise in implementing the convention. And it has 54 different articles that cover all aspects of the child's life. Article 28 is a child's right to education. I did do a quick check. It doesn't mention anywhere energy anywhere. But I think that's perhaps that will change in the future, and I'll explain a little bit why later on. So there are plenty of like great things that UNICEF have done with together with partners and governments. Of course, it's important to stress, UNICEF is not doing this alone. Everywhere we work together with governments, and it's not usually UNICEF that are the ones that are doing the actual like construction or the delivery of supplies or things like that. It's usually we are doing that kind of in support of others, so government and other partners. So these are some of the key milestones. 1946, that was when UNICEF was established, straight after World War II. In 1965, UNICEF was the first organization, I believe, to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And then in 1980, UNICEF played like a part in the eradication of smallpox, because immunization is a huge part of UNICEF's work. I would say, like, particularly on the procurement of vaccines and delivery and supporting government to administer those campaigns. 1989 was referring back to the document I was talking about, the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This was the landmark year for that convention. 2005, UNICEF worked with partners on a big HIV and AIDS campaign that saw the rates of deaths in children and young people kind of plummet quite rapidly. And then, of course, very current, COVID-19, starting in 2020. This was actually because UNICEF was not present during World War II. So COVID-19 was the biggest response that UNICEF has ever been a part of. And I think like one statistic is UNICEF worked with governments to support like 300 million children worldwide to get distance learning whilst the schools were closed. That's like looking back, like looking for like today and forwards. So just to give you a bit of like sense of the scale and the scope and the size of what UNICEF does. So we're present in 190 countries and territories around the world. There's just a few that we're not. And we're very much an organization that works like, in countries. So we only have like 15% of the staff actually like in the headquarters, and everybody else is there like in the countries working with the partners and governments. We have 15,000 staff, and we work at the global, regional, and country levels. And just to give you an idea of the expenditure, it was over 7 billion last year. In terms of like what we do, this is our current strategic plan. We have like every 4 years, we have a new strategic plan. We look at like what are the most current issues for children globally, and then we define our strategic plan basically. So these 5 goal areas are the core of our work. So goal area 4, for example, it's a little bit cryptic, but the actual goal is stated: every child lives in a safe and sustainable climate and environment. So this is very much like where my work kind of sits under this goal area 4, covering water, sanitation, energy, environment, disaster risk reduction. Other goal areas, so like for example, goal area 1 is, again, I say it's cryptic because the goal is every child survives and thrives. And essentially this is our work on health and nutrition. But although climate sustainability comes under this goal area 4, that's just to show that it's like something that's very important for us. But of course, we work across all of these different goal areas on climate sustainability as well. So, for example, in education, we are working to ensure that schools and all the educational systems are prepared to deal with climate shocks. And by focusing on these 5 key areas, these all feed up into the Sustainable Development Goals. So UNICEF's not leading on all of these ones that are highlighted, these 12 ones that are highlighted. It just showing that we have a contribution to make in each of these 12 goal areas, and some of them we are taking a much more leading role than other UN agencies. For example, Goal 6 on clean water and sanitation, UNICEF very much has a strong kind of leadership role in that goal. And then the final one, just a bit more general background on UNICEF, is that it's quite easy. I think a lot of you may have seen, like when you think of UNICEF, you might think, okay, UNICEF is a humanitarian organization. It's there like responding to emergencies, for example, now in Turkey and Syria. And that is part of our core work. And that is things like, building infrastructure, emergency supplies, but it's only like half of our work. So I think the other half of our work, which often is less known, is our like longer term development work. So this is where we very much like work with the governments and partners to try and strengthen the systems within the country. So it's working to strengthen policies, trying to increase finance for services, building the capacity of the people working in the countries. With a bit of infrastructure, but it's usually infrastructure to demonstrate a successful model and then encourage the government to scale these successful models up. So that's more generally on UNICEF. If we like zoom in a little bit more now to climate and sustainability, I'll just try and play this film because I think this actually tells it much better than I would, and it gives it gives an overview of how UNICEF kind of thinks about and views the climate sustainability crisis, and also touches on like what are we doing, and then I'll go into a little bit more depth after that. So I think I need to switch and then play. Oh, yeah, okay. I think there's no volume, no?
Not entirely sure. You sure?
Shall I try now? Do I full screen like that? Okay, looks good. All right. So yeah, I think that film, it's of course, as you realize, it's like spoken from the perspective of God, right? But it does very much kind of capture in a quite simplistic way, what UNICEF and the children that we work with, what's their thinking on climate change generally, okay, like broadly speaking, and also what's UNICEF's response to that. So this is just kind of a recap on that. So UNICEF's position is very much that like the climate crisis is a child's rights crisis. It's affecting all children, but of course it affects children differently depending on like their situation, and it impacts them throughout their life. It's disproportionately affecting like children in the more vulnerable situations, more marginalized situations, and it actually making the situation worse in a lot of cases. From our perspective, like from UNICEF's perspective, we understand that like climate change mitigation is key, and it's the only long-term solution to climate change. And that, but what is like our realization is that okay, even with the current kind of targets and roadmap now, that will be too late for a lot of those children who will already be impacted because they haven't been able to adapt sufficiently in time for the impacts that are already happening now and in the next 50 whatever years. And even without adaptation, of course, there will still be loss and damages that will affect those children. So we then see that like we have a role as UNICEF to kind of to back up and support those children to be able to adapt to climate change, to be more resilient, and to support them like in elevating and raising their voices on the global platform. And as the video said, we're doing like different three kind of main things. So point 5 here is again like a bit of a summary of our approach. So the first one is about providing both resilient and sustainable basic social services for children. So making sure that their education is resilient to climate change, making sure their health services are resilient to climate change, etc. Then the second is that piece about like it's like two sides of it, like working with the children to give them the skills and the knowledge that they need to be able to like personally adapt themselves to climate change, but also giving them the skills and knowledge so that they can then engage like in the global kind of discourse and also within the countries in the discourse on climate change. So it's like they have their voice already, but of course it's like UNICEF can help them to reach different audiences and get a stage on different platforms, which is what we've done a lot of at the different COP conferences, for example. And then the third one is more like an enabler, and this is working with governments to ensure that children are very much like center of climate policies. So the NDCs on the national adaptation plans, but then also like that climate finance is also more child sensitive. So more of that climate finance is going to services that benefit children. So yeah, we say that like climate change is a child's rights crisis. So, but then we need to know like where are the children that are most affected by climate change if we want to try and help them. So this is a really cool piece of work that the UNICEF did with University of Edinburgh recently. I think 2021 it was published. The Children's Climate Risk Index, CCRI. And it's the first time that there was a specific like index on climate change from the adaptation resilience perspective related to children. So, and it looks from two perspectives. It looks at, so in order to calculate the risk, it looks at first the exposure of children to different climate and environmental hazards, shocks and stresses, and then overlays that with underlying child vulnerability. So obviously like children perhaps in this country, if they were exposed to the same hazard that maybe a child in, I don't know, like Malawi was, children in this country may be more resilient, of course, because they have better access to social services, they have better knowledge, so they wouldn't necessarily be so much at risk. So that's why we overlay like the exposures with the underlying child vulnerability, and then we map that spatially, and I'll show you in a second, to see like and try and identify where like the children most at risk to climate change are. And you can see a lot of the different shocks and stresses we use here. And this is the result. So this map, I know it's a bit small, but yeah, this map basically is the composite index of those exposures and vulnerabilities, and it's aggregated to national level. Of course, it's not. Of course, it's like much more granular and spatial than that, but it's just been aggregated to the national level. And then, if there's a certain threshold of children that are at risk within that country, then it's assigned like a very extremely high risk or high risk to climate change. And perhaps unsurprisingly, many of those countries, the dark purple, most at risk, are in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Going back to the point I was talking about earlier about like, the risk is the function of the exposure and the vulnerability. If we start to play with that vulnerability side of the equation, if we start to like give or provide children with better access to social services, you can see that this, I haven't got the picture, but the map changes, and then you can see that these risk levels go down in countries in sub-Saharan Africa through providing these services. And there's just some quantified numbers there. And the future of this is, so this is the current snapshot, and then we further work looking like forward at projections. Okay, how does this change under different like future scenarios for climate change? And we'll also do like at the subnational level more detail. So again, this is the three pillars of our response. The first one is strengthening the resilience, sustainability of services. This is very much where like our work on sustainable energy comes in, and I'll get to that in a second. The second is, yes, supporting young people to be climate environment champions. And the third is that policy and finance piece, making sure that it's targeting children. And this is just a highlight of some of the climate environment results from last year. So we're working in, although we work in 190 countries, we don't work on climate environment in every country yet. I think we will eventually, but at the moment we have 81 countries, and last year we provided like 1,500 solar powered water systems. We engaged 700,000 youth in climate activism in their countries. And we worked with governments in 83 countries to make sure that policies are more child-sensitive, climate policies, I should say. Now, zooming in a bit deeper into sustainable energy and UNICEF's kind of take on this. So, yeah, we very much like, for us, it's not about like climate change mitigation. It's not about emissions reduction. It's like that is a secondary benefit that we also need to get better at quantifying. But the main entry point for us is that we see that sustainable energy is actually a great enabler for children, particularly in these off-grid locations in a lot of the places where I've worked. And we really think that, it can really strengthen the access of children to sustainable social services. And there are some of the key reasons there. So bipolar in health centers, that health center can provide more services for that child. So, and then that child will have better health outcomes. One key thing, the second point there at the end, cold chain is something that UNICEF works a lot on. Cold chain is basically like, for those who might not know, it's all about getting like vaccinations to the remotest like parts of the world. So you can imagine a COVID vaccination drive or a polio drive, and getting those vaccines to places where there's no electricity. Then of course you need to keep those vaccines cool. So sustainable energy, particularly solar energy, can play a key role in doing that. We see, renewable energy and sustainable energy as a important aspect of education, also for reducing indoor air pollution. This is more about switching from kind of harmful indoor cooking practices that use fossil fuels to more sustainable practices. And we also see it's a security issue as well. Like we do a lot of work in refugee camps, for example. And as you might imagine, like security is a big issue in those places. So, and if there's no grid, then we need like other ways of providing lighting. So energy priorities, I should say, like the third kind of pillar there, right-sized off-grid solution deployment. We've been doing this for many years, like 20, 30 years, particularly in the solar space. But on the other pillars, this work is more kind of, it's more emerging for us, I would say. So we've done like more infrastructural work in the past, particularly on solar, as you'll see from the examples. But yeah, our work actually more recently has started looking at, okay, how can we work with young people and engage with them on their ideas and their engagement more broadly on sustainable energy? How can we support them? And how can we give them more skills and knowledge on the subject? The second is working like very much like upstream with governments on policies. As I said, the third one, off-grid solutions. And the fourth is UNICEF has quite a large procurement function and supply function based out of Copenhagen. And so we have quite a big stake in some of the markets, like particularly for solar in some locations in some countries, because it may not have been there like much previously and then UNICEF have gone in and brought like a lot more of that to the fore. And then just an example of some of the ongoing engagements in off-grid solutions, particularly water and sanitation. We've got programs in 45 countries. I showed you a picture earlier, I forgot to mention. Probably our biggest infrastructural project on solar is in the Gaza Strip, which is the solar desalination plant, which is powered by solar, fully powered by solar. And then, as I said, on the health side, yeah, we've done a lot of work on the cold chain, on vaccinations for many years. But more and more recently, we've shifting also our work into the electrification and solarization of health centers and also schools as well. And this is just an idea of the scale of our work. It might be something quite small in some countries, it might be quite substantial in other countries. So, and yeah, and just a reminder, like why we're doing this. We're really doing this because we think it can improve child outcomes and impacts on children's lives. So by providing sustainable energy in a health center, this can reduce child mortality rates. By including sustainable energy in a school, it can improve the quality of the learning outcomes. And you see some other more health-related ones there. So this is our reason for getting into this kind of space. Just a few more detailed examples. This is quite cool. This is quite nice. I was having a chat, I think just yesterday, with our office in Western Central Africa. This is in office in Senegal, in Dakar. And they've set up a kind of technical assistance hub specifically for solar in that region. So that particular region for UNICEF, there's about 20 different countries. And the idea is that we want to scale up this work on sustainable energy in the region. But we don't necessarily have always the expertise within each of those different countries. So they've set up this technical assistance hub so that any of those countries, so the UNICEF offices, but also the governments and partners can reach out and get advice all the way from doing kind of assessments through to planning systems, designing procurement, all the way through to operational maintenance. And this is just an idea here, a few of the bullets of some of the services that they offer. And the chart there just shows the requests coming in are kind of scaling up, and particularly in the last year or so, it's getting a lot of demand. And we have a plan to scale this up globally. I think we have about 7 different regions, so we want to try and have one of these hubs in all of those regions. So yeah, This is in Malawi. So this is quite a nice story. I'll tell you why in a second or so. So this is where we've used solar energy to combine access to drinking water in a community, at the same time providing access to water in the health centre, whilst also providing power for the health centre. And that photo you see there on the bottom right hand side, this is one of these solar powered fridges where they store the vaccines. So, and this health centre is in quite a remote part of Malawi. And the objective of this program in Malawi, it's really to provide green and reliable electricity to these hard to reach health facilities, to improve the climate resilience also of those services. I would say not just climate resilience, also just resilience generally, right? Then it's also the second objective is to improve the key like child health outcomes. MNH means like maternal neonatal health, including immunization. But also, yeah, as you can imagine, perhaps like for the staff working in these remote areas is not always the easiest, and there is quite a lot of staff turnover because they don't always have the equipment and tools that they feel that they need to do their job. So by providing the electricity, the power, then actually allows them to do their job much better, and there's better job satisfaction. And yeah, just to give you some idea of some of the challenges of installing these systems, obviously dust storms, damage, sometimes vandalism as well. So the team in Malawi have seen that, the key to this, although it's a tried and tested and proven solution, in order for it to work, there has to be a big focus on operation and maintenance. And if you're putting these quite or relatively high-tech systems in places, you need to also provide the technical support for the people there to know how to operate and manage them, whilst also ensuring that there is a fallback support from district level. And just to finish this story, I think this is quite nice because it shows this idea of resilience, basically. So in January last year, there was a hurricane, Storm Anna, which impacted the country. And unfortunately, in Malawi, it's the country's hasn't diversified its power supply. So it's the bulk of the power supply for the country comes from the hydroelectric power plant on the Lake Malawi. So if that gets knocked out, which it did, then it really has a huge problem for the rest of the country. So as you can see, it knocked out a third of the power capacity for the country, and there was blackout in different parts across the whole country for 2 days. But despite that, these solutions that UNICEF was working with government to put in, of course, because they were on solar power, they functioned throughout throughout this situation. So I think this is really nice because it shows what I'm trying to kind of convey in this presentation is that sustainable energy can really enable this resilience of these services. So another quick film. I hope I have time. We're good for time, Sawyer? Yeah, all good. Do you know how I switched to the other one?
It's just on the other tab.
Oh yeah, thank you. So I should have said, sorry, that's obviously an example from UNICEF Sudan, more from the education perspective. 1 second. Okay, so moving away from like more kind of infrastructural projects, this is also something just to show you recently that we've been working on together with the SDG 7 Youth Constituency and in partnership with the International Renewable Energy Agency. So, of course, like not everyone has like the same understanding about energy, and children also need to be supported with their education in that sense. So we saw like a gap that there wasn't really much kind of child friendly, we call it, like information out there about sustainable energy. So we wanted to partner with the youth constituency and the agency to develop this toolkit that is more accessible to anyone. You see the English version there on the screen, but there are also I think it's in Spanish and maybe some other languages as well. And we really feel that this can help empower children and to call on governments to realize their rights. And just on the policy side as well, to show you the policy. So UNICEF is a member of the SDG 7 Technical Advisory Group. So with partners, we contributed to the policy brief particularly on education recently, and we had some say in like some of the indicators that were being proposed about measuring access to energy for children in schools, and also that sustainable energy should be part of the curriculum in vocational and higher education. Because like the way UNICEF's approach, like I said earlier, is we try and take a holistic approach by working on system strengthening. So doing projects like the ones you've seen, like with a lot of kind of infrastructure, solar, showing that these models work, and then working with governments to see how can we scale that up and how can we ensure the policy, the financing, regulation systems are in place for this scaling up. And yeah, just looking forwards, like just some thoughts on perhaps UNICEF's thinking going forward, is that we have, like I said, now some good examples of successful approaches of off-grid solutions. So, but we would love these, of course, to be taken more to scale. So we'll be working with our partners in government to do that. And I think we also need to get better at like quantifying the impacts. And I think that goes on both sides. So, of course, the reason we're doing this is for impacts for the child. But measuring that is not always the easiest thing to do, of course. So measuring like reductions in child mortality that are attributable to sustainable energy in healthcare, not always that straightforward. But also the more like environmental side of it. I mean, quite often we have like funders coming to us who want to support ESG programs, things like that. But of course, they are very hot and very keen on metrics to be able to measure like what are the emissions avoided, things like that. So this is really another space where I think we will be doing more work, hopefully, in the future. The other one is about policy support. Like, so as you probably know, like the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment was officially like endorsed by the UN General Assembly last year. So now it's about like how do we like support governments to kind of implement those rights? How do we make sense of it and implement it? And the other one there is I mentioned the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child earlier. So there is a right there about an adequate standard of living. And what is happening as we speak actually is that the committee for that convention, they've requested people in the sector to like what does the human right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment mean for children. So there's an ongoing consultation, and in the drafts of that consultation, I've seen that energy is coming in there quite a bit, particularly under the right to an adequate standard of living, both from the perspective of like enjoying access to energy, but also from the perspective of ensuring that that's clean energy and it's not impacting children's health. So I think it's coming, which is really positive. And finally, also, we want to continue our work very much with young people. UNICEF's very much there to kind of, support young people, and we have an obligation to, respond to what they are interested in and their kind of wishes and desires, and help them attain their rights. And this is just some resources. There's a link there. Maybe I can share it with Sawyer, and he can forward onto the group. This is like more generally about UNICEF's work, and then you can drill down and you can find more about sustainable energy in there. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Robin. I think we can open up the questions. So we can, generally, if anyone has questions, let's ask them. Maybe take two.
I had a question.
Could you tell us a little bit more about what you do in your day-to-day role?
My day-to-day role. Okay, so it's a bit different. So I'm not working in the headquarters. So, but I represent like the UNICEF global organization in the UK on anything to do with climate and environment. So my role is so I don't do like the direct implementation of programs myself, and I don't oversee those. I have done in the past when I worked in Mongolia and Malawi, but now my role is very much like trying to understand globally everything that UNICEF's doing on climate and environment, which, believe me, it's not easy to do that when we're working in 190 countries, and then try and translate that to a UK audience. So that's why I love like coming to talks like this to, raise awareness on what UNICEF's doing. I also raise awareness within UNICEF UK on our environmental work, and then what we're doing is we're trying to raise funds from private sector within the UK, get them interested in our work, raise funds for climate environment, and implement that. So, and I also do like a lot of liaison with our country offices. So because I have like a kind of international development experience, so I have some understanding of like how things more or less like, some insights into how things work within the countries. Then I'm more like the face of UNICEF UK when I interact with the rest of the global organization. So, and then I try and do as much technical things as I can. It's not always easy because this is the first role I would say I've had that is not that technical. Like all of my previous roles were like very technical, like very hands-on, or doing like kind of policy research, think tank work. So this is like a little bit quite different, I would say. Oh yeah.
Sure. I was just wondering what a climate resilient education looks like. Climate resilient education. How do you make that happen? What does that entail?
So it's like from different perspectives. It's the kind of the hardware, we call it, like infrastructure. So it's providing access to sustainable energy. It's also ensuring that like schools are built with the consideration of like flooding, things which you might think like obvious, but not always, right? So doing an assessment of what are the like climate shocks and stresses that might affect that particular location, and then making sure that that's like considered in the design of the infrastructure. But not only that, like, so that's on the infrastructure side, but then on the more like education continuity side, so making sure that education runs like throughout disasters. Of course, like disasters can be climate related, or they can be just general disasters, right? So, but making sure there's a plan in there to ensure like continuity of education, no matter what the disaster is, and so making sure that's in place and actually acted on as well. So if there is an emergency, that kind of plan is put into place. So that's also about like working with government to ensure that that's put into plan. And then I think like the final piece, well, maybe there's a couple of pieces like there's a framework for disaster risk reduction in schools, and then as part of that, there's you do like emergency drills in schools, so like in disaster-prone areas, making sure that the children themselves are aware and prepared for disasters. And the final one is like actually educating the children about climate change and what they can do and help themselves to adapt to climate change as well. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think like we'll discuss more questions for Robin. I think we'll all be like such. Let's just give another round.